The towers stood like silent giants against the November sky. 8 milk tea-colored sentinels that had watched over the people of Taipo for 42 years. For thousands of residents, these buildings were more than concrete and steel. They were home. They were where children learned to walk, where families celebrated birthdays, where elderly couples watched sunsets after decades of shared memories. Wednesday, November 26, 2025, started like any other day in Hong Kong. The weather was dry, almost unnervingly so. The Hong Kong Observatory had issued a red fire danger warning that morning. But warnings are just words on a screen until they become reality. And reality was about to arrive with devastating speed. At exactly 2 p.m., somewhere in the lower floors of Wang Chong House, Block F, something ignited. A resident in the neighboring Block G smelled smoke drifting through her window. Through a gap in the green construction mesh that wrapped the building like a shroud, she spotted a small flame. Just a small flame. She tried calling property management. No answer. She rushed downstairs to alert the security guard. By the time she returned to her apartment to shelter in place, the small flame had already begun its vertical climb. In the moments that followed, Hong Kong would witness its worst residential fire in 77 years. A fire that would claim at least 160 lives. A fire where many victims would die without ever hearing an alarm. A fire where silence would become more terrifying than screams. This is the story of what really happened at Wang Fuk Court. This is the story of the minutes, the decisions, the warnings ignored, and the people whose dreams were consumed by flames that should never have spread at all. The fire was reported at 2:51 p.m., 51 minutes after that first resident smelled smoke. 51 minutes where the small flame had found fuel, had tasted oxygen, had discovered the perfect conditions to transform from a flicker into an inferno. By 2:45 p.m., eyewitness reports confirmed that the bamboo scaffolding along the exterior walls of Wang Chiang House was burning. The scaffolding, that traditional Hong Kong construction technique where workers expertly lash together bamboo poles with wire to create intricate webs around buildings. For over a century, it had been part of the city's identity, cheap, versatile, renewable, but also highly combustible. And on this day, it was wrapped in something even more dangerous, the green netting. That protective mesh contractors drape over scaffolding to prevent debris from falling onto pedestrians below. Standard practice, required by law. But here's what investigators would later discover. The netting wasn't fire retardant. Not all of it. After a typhoon damaged the original materials in July 2025, contractors had replaced sections with cheaper, non-compliant mesh. They mixed it with the approved materials, creating a deadly patchwork that inspectors couldn't easily detect. When the Labor Department tested samples after the fire, 7 out of 20 failed safety standards. 7. The contractors had cut corners to increase profits, gambling with thousands of lives. And that wasn't even the worst part. Every window in the complex had been sealed with expanded polystyrene foam boards. Styrofoam. Highly flammable styrofoam covering the windows of every single floor in all 8 buildings.
The renovation plans called for these boards to protect glass during exterior repairs. But residents had raised concerns months earlier. In September 2014, more than a year before the fire, a group of homeowners gathered in the green space below the towers. They held a cigarette lighter under one of the foam boards. It burst into flames immediately. They brought their concerns to representatives from the architecture firm overseeing the project. They filed complaints with the Labor Department. The Labor Department conducted 16 inspections between July 2014 and November 2015. 16 times officials visited the site. 16 times they issued warnings and notices about fire safety. The final inspection occurred on November 20th, 2015, 6 days before 160 people would die. The inspectors issued another written reminder about fire prevention measures. Then they left. The fire began its ascent. The bamboo poles, aged and dry, caught quickly. The green netting, sections of it nothing more than plastic mesh, ignited like paper. Burning fragments began to fall, spiraling down through the scaffolding like meteors, starting new fires on lower levels, even as the main blaze climbed higher. The wind was picking up. Hong Kong's dense urban canyons create unpredictable air currents, and on this day, those currents became the fire's accomplice. Within minutes, the flames had reached the upper floors of Wang Chang House, and then they found the styrofoam. When the foam boards caught fire, they didn't just burn. They exploded. The intense heat shattered windows from the inside, sending glass cascading down, while superheated air rushed in, feeding the inferno. The fire had breached the exterior and entered the apartments. And here's where the silence becomes most haunting. Residents later described a strange, terrifying quiet inside the buildings. Many never heard a fire alarm, not one. Investigators would later confirm that none of the fire alarms in any of the 8 towers activated properly during the blaze. In a high-rise building where nearly 40% of residents were 65 or older, where mobility was limited and evacuation required time, the alarm systems failed completely. No bells, no sirens, no automated voice telling people to evacuate immediately. Instead, residents learned about the fire from neighbors pounding frantically on doors, from messages in WeChat groups, from phone calls from family members watching the news, from seeing smoke seep under their doors, from feeling the heat through their walls. A man named Juan was resting at home on the 8th floor. He heard people screaming for help outside. Only then did he get up to look. The instant he opened his window, smoke engulfed his face. By then it was 3:15 p.m., 30 minutes since the fire had been officially reported. The flames had already spread to other towers. He grabbed his 2 dogs and his wallet and fled down the emergency stairwell. It smelled of gas. Another resident tried to escape but found the corridor and stairs filled with darkness and smoke. She retreated to her apartment, sealing the door, waiting for rescue that might never come. Some residents never even tried to leave. The elderly, the bedridden, those caring for loved ones who couldn't move. They sheltered in place, hoping the fire would pass them by. Many of them would never be found alive. The first fire trucks arrived by 3:02 p.m., 11 minutes after the initial call. They found a scene of absolute chaos. The exterior scaffolding was already fully engulfed in flames. Burning bamboo poles were collapsing, creating a rain of flaming debris that made approach nearly impossible.
The fire was classified as a number 1 alarm initially. By 3:34 p.m., it had been upgraded to number 4. By 6:22 p.m., it reached number 5, the highest possible emergency classification. The first time Hong Kong had seen a 5-alarm fire since 2008. At the height of operations, over 1,200 fire and ambulance personnel were deployed, more than 200 fire apparatus, 100 ambulances, 26 search and rescue teams working simultaneously across multiple towers, 400 police officers helping with evacuation and perimeter control. But the fire was spreading faster than they could respond. From Wang Chang House to Wang Tai House, then to Wang Yu House, Wang Hua House, Wang Xing House, Wang Pak House, Wang Ming House. 7 of the 8 towers engulfed. Only Wang Chi House, Block H, somehow remained untouched. The wind carried embers from building to building. The connected scaffolding created bridges for the flames. The foam boards on every window provided fuel at every level. The fire climbed the towers like a predator, floor by floor, consuming everything in its path. Inside the buildings, conditions were apocalyptic. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius in some areas. Smoke so thick that visibility dropped to zero. Falling debris blocking stairwells, gas lines rupturing, electrical systems failing, plunging corridors into absolute darkness. Search and rescue teams advanced floor by floor using thermal imaging cameras to detect survivors through the smoke. They found people huddled in bathrooms with wet towels under doors. They found people on rooftops waiting for helicopter rescue. They found people who had collapsed just meters from safety. One elderly man was rescued from the 31st floor rooftop 20 hours after the fire began. Dehydrated, disoriented, but alive. His rescue sparked a moment of hope amid overwhelming despair. But for every person rescued, there were dozens more who would never be found alive.
Firefighter Ho Wai Ho, 37 years old, a 9-year veteran with the Sha Tin Fire Station, entered the ground floor of one of the towers shortly after 3 p.m. He was part of the first response team. At 3:30 p.m., he lost contact with his unit. His colleagues searched frantically through smoke and flames. They found him collapsed at the scene. He was rushed to Prince of Wales Hospital. At 4:41 p.m., doctors declared him dead, the first firefighter to die in the line of duty in this disaster. He left behind colleagues who called him devoted. He left behind a family waiting for him to come home. He left behind the knowledge that he had run toward danger while others fled, because that's what firefighters do. The fire burned for 40 hours. 40 hours of crews fighting flames, searching apartments, carrying out bodies. 40 hours of families waiting outside police cordons, holding photos of their loved ones, asking anyone in uniform if they had seen them. 40 hours of uncertainty that transformed into agonizing confirmation. On November 28th at 10:18 a.m., the Hong Kong Fire Services Department finally declared the blaze under control. The fire was not extinguished, but it was no longer spreading. By then, the death toll had reached 128, and it would keep climbing. The victims ranged in age from 1-year-old to 97. 1-year-old, a baby who had barely begun to experience life. 97 years old, someone who had lived through nearly a century of Hong Kong's history, only to perish in their own home. The elderly made up a significant portion of the casualties. Many lived alone. Many had mobility issues. Many couldn't evacuate quickly, even if they'd been warned. But the fire didn't discriminate. It took young families. It took middle-aged parents. It took 10 foreign domestic workers from Indonesia and the Philippines, women who had traveled thousands of miles to support their families back home. Women who lived in cramped quarters, serving Hong Kong households. Women whose bodies would need to be identified through DNA and sent back to countries where grieving families waited. It took 5 construction workers who had tried to put out the initial flames before being forced to retreat indoors. Men who were just trying to do their jobs. Men who became trapped in the very scaffolding they had erected. Lawrence Lee waited in one of the emergency shelters for news about his wife. When the fire started, he had called her, told her to escape. She tried. But once she left their apartment, the corridor and stairwell were filled with smoke and darkness. She had no choice but to return to the flat. He never heard from her again. A 71-year-old man named Wang reacted emotionally after claiming his wife was trapped inside. Journalists captured his anguish, his desperate hope, his eventual devastation. A mother lost her baby in the fire. How do you process that? How do you wake up the next morning in a world where your child is gone, consumed by flames that should never have spread? One resident wrote on social media about standing in the wreckage of his apartment after being allowed briefly back inside. Everything destroyed. 40 years of memories reduced to ash. He wrote that he wanted to take everything, but could take nothing. Instead, he stood quietly, looking around, saying a final farewell to a home that no longer existed. By December 9, 2025, the confirmed death toll reached 160 people. 6 remain unaccounted for, their bodies potentially reduced to ash, potentially buried under collapsed scaffolding outside the buildings, potentially never to be identified. The Disaster Victims Identification Unit deployed 600 specialists who went apartment by apartment, floor by floor. They worked in darkness, in extreme heat, navigating narrow corridors blocked by fallen debris. They found bodies in apartments, in stairwells, in public corridors. Some victims had died from smoke inhalation, some from burns, some from falls while trying to escape, some in ways too horrific to describe. 39 bodies remain unidentified. DNA samples are being collected from families who believe their loved ones perished but have no closure, no body to bury, no final goodbye. Just absence where presence used to be.
Here's what should have prevented this. Here's what could have stopped 160 people from dying. First, the materials. If the construction company had used properly fire-retardant netting as required by Hong Kong's safety code, the fire would have spread far more slowly. If they hadn't sealed every window with highly flammable foam boards, the fire wouldn't have penetrated the building so quickly. These were choices. Business decisions. Cost-cutting measures that prioritize profit over human life. Prestige Construction and Engineering Company had a history of safety violations. Convicted twice in 2023, fined repeatedly. One of their shareholders had been imprisoned in 2009 for bribing officials. This was a company that had proven they couldn't be trusted with safety. Yet they were hired to conduct a 300 million Hong Kong dollar renovation on buildings housing 4,600 people. Second, the inspections. 16 times the Labor Department visited the site. 16 times they identified problems. But inspections without enforcement are theater. They issued warnings, improvement notices, written reminders, but they didn't shut down the project. They didn't force compliance. They allowed work to continue with substandard materials wrapping buildings full of families. Why? Was it bureaucratic inertia? Fear of delaying an expensive project? Corruption? An independent inquiry will investigate, but the questions remain. What is an inspection worth if violations continue? What is a warning worth if nobody listens? Third, the alarms. Every fire alarm in all 8 towers failed to activate. Failed! In a disaster scenario, early warning is everything. Seconds matter. Minutes can mean the difference between evacuation and entrapment. The residents of Wang Fuk Court were robbed of those crucial minutes because the systems designed to protect them didn't work. How does that happen? Were the alarms disconnected during renovation? Were they not maintained? Were they simply too old to function? The Hong Kong Fire Services Department is investigating, but the damage is done. People died because they didn't know they were in danger until it was too late. Fourth, the evacuation. Once the fire began spreading from the first tower to others, why weren't the other buildings evacuated immediately? Authorities have struggled to answer this. The fire jumped from building to building within minutes. But there was a window, a narrow window, where organized evacuation of the non-affected towers might have saved lives. That window closed quickly, suffocated by smoke and flames and falling debris, but it existed, and it wasn't used. Why? Did incident commanders underestimate how fast the fire would spread? Did they focus resources on fighting the blaze rather than evacuation? Did the lack of functional fire alarms make coordinated evacuation impossible? These are questions that haunt every disaster, the what-ifs that survivors and victims' families will carry forever. And here's the most disturbing part. Residents had warned about this exact scenario. For over a year, they raised concerns about the fire hazards. They demonstrated how quickly the foam boards burned. They filed complaints. They used official channels. They did everything right. And they were ignored. The Labor Department told them they faced relatively low fire risks after investigating their concerns. Low risk. 160 people dead. That phrase will become part of Hong Kong's history, a symbol of catastrophic failure, a reminder that bureaucratic assessments mean nothing if they're wrong. And they were devastatingly wrong. The arrested individuals now face manslaughter charges. 2 directors of Prestige Construction, an engineering consultant. 14 people total have been arrested as investigations expanded to include corruption and bid rigging. The Hong Kong anti-corruption body is probing whether bribes influenced the contractor selection, whether officials were paid to overlook violations, whether the entire system was compromised from the beginning.
But arrests don't bring back the dead. Prison sentences won't comfort grieving families. Justice in court is necessary but insufficient. What's needed is systemic change. Hong Kong's government has promised reforms. They've ordered inspections of all public housing estates undergoing major renovations. They've announced plans to phase out bamboo scaffolding in favor of metal for high-rise projects. They've established a 300 million Hong Kong dollar fund to help victims, which through donations has grown to over $2 billion. They've pledged to reform the building renovation system entirely. But promises made after disaster are easy. The real test comes in implementation. Will the reforms be enforced? Will contractors face real consequences for violations? Will inspectors have the authority to shut down dangerous projects? Will fire safety systems be properly maintained? Will residents' concerns be taken seriously before tragedy strikes? Chief Executive John Lee pledged that those responsible would be held accountable regardless of who they are. He promised an independent committee led by a judge would investigate and make results public. He vowed that such a thing would never happen again. But Hong Kong has heard promises before. The city watched in 2019 as massive protests erupted over political grievances. Those protests were met with national security laws and crackdowns. Now, in the aftermath of this fire, authorities are warning against anti-China sentiment, against attempts to sow discord, against using the tragedy for political purposes. 3 people have been arrested on national security grounds for distributing materials supporting an online petition calling for government accountability. An Instagram page demanding an independent inquiry and justice for victims was taken down. Beijing's security office issued warnings about external hostile forces trying to create chaos.
This is the tension Hong Kong now faces. How to demand accountability without being accused of subversion. How to mourn without being silenced. How to prevent future disasters without questioning the system that allowed this one. But grief doesn't follow political boundaries, and anger at preventable death isn't foreign interference. It's human. The thousands of people who have visited makeshift memorials near Wang Fuk Court, laying flowers and writing messages on walls, aren't trying to disrupt Hong Kong. They're trying to honor the dead. They're trying to make sense of senseless loss. They're trying to ensure that 160 lives weren't lost for nothing. The victims had dreams. The 1-year-old baby who died would never take first steps, never speak first words, never experience childhood. The elderly residents who perished had survived decades of Hong Kong's transformation, only to die in buildings that were supposed to be made safer. The foreign domestic workers sent money home to support children they rarely saw, dreaming of the day they could return permanently. Those children are now fatherless, motherless, waiting for bodies to arrive in caskets. The construction workers who died were just doing their jobs, earning wages to support families, never imagining they'd become victims of the very project they were building.
The firefighter who gave his life was a hero, running toward danger to save others, but he was also a son, potentially a husband, a colleague, a friend who deserved to go home that night. Every single victim was loved by someone. Every single death created a ripple of devastation through families, through communities, through the fabric of Hong Kong society. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't an unavoidable tragedy. This was preventable. Every element that contributed to the catastrophic spread of the fire was a human choice. The choice to use cheap materials. The choice to seal windows with flammable foam. The choice to ignore resident concerns. The choice to prioritize profit over safety. The choice to allow a company with a history of violations to conduct work on occupied high-rises. These choices created the conditions for disaster. And when the small flame ignited on the afternoon of November 26th, those conditions transformed it into an inferno.
The silence haunts survivors most. The absence of alarms. The quiet moments before neighbors began pounding on doors. The surreal experience of realizing your home is burning without any warning system alerting you. One resident described opening his door to find everything went black, thick smoke engulfing him instantly. He retreated inside, sealed himself in, survived. But that moment of opening a door into darkness, into the unknown, not knowing if the next breath would be his last, that trauma stays. Another resident wrote about being unable to see his own hand even with his phone flashlight on, about struggling to breathe, about the primitive fear of being trapped in darkness while fire consumed everything around him. This is what "no one screamed" means. This is the silent disaster. Not silent because people didn't react, but silent because the systems that should have warned them failed. Silent because by the time residents realized the danger, screaming wouldn't help. Silent because the speed of the fire's spread gave many victims no time to react at all. Silent because some died in their sleep, overcome by smoke before they could even wake. Silent because others died trying to help loved ones who couldn't move. Silent because the terror was so complete, so overwhelming, that survival required action, not sound. The towers of Wang Fuk Court still stand, blackened skeletons wrapped in the remnants of scaffolding that became their shroud. They stand as monuments to failure, to the failure of safety systems, of oversight, of accountability. But they also stand as reminders. Reminders that behind every statistic is a story. That behind every death toll is a human being whose life mattered. Reminders that disaster is often preventable if we choose to prevent it. That regulation without enforcement is meaningless. That warnings without action are empty words. That the most vulnerable among us, the elderly, the young, the foreign workers, deserve protection most of all.
Hong Kong will recover from this. Buildings will be rebuilt, survivors will find new homes, time will pass. But 160 people will not recover. Their families will not recover. The trauma of those who escaped, who watched their homes burn, who lost everything, does not simply heal. This disaster will echo through generations. Children who lost parents, parents who lost children. A city that lost faith in systems designed to protect them. The final question is the one that should keep leaders awake at night. What will Hong Kong learn from this? Will the reforms be real and lasting? Will accountability mean something? Will future residents of high-rise buildings undergoing renovation be protected by systems that actually work? Or will this become another tragedy marked by moments of silence, by flowers laid at memorials, by promises that fade as attention moves elsewhere? The dead cannot speak, but their absence screams. It screams at those who cut corners, at those who ignored warnings, at those who allowed profit to matter more than people. It screams for justice,
for change, for the guarantee that no other family will receive the call that their loved one died in a preventable fire, that no other resident will open a door into darkness and suffocating smoke, that no other community will watch their homes burn while wondering why no one heard the alarms. Wang Fuk Court was home to 4,600 people. It was where they raised families, celebrated holidays, grew old together. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be made safer through renovation. Instead, that renovation created the conditions for Hong Kong's deadliest fire in 77 years. This is the story of Wang Fuk Court, a story of disaster, of failure, of lives cut short, but also a story that demands to be told, to be remembered, to be learned from, because the 160 people who died deserve more than to be forgotten. They deserve a Hong Kong that actually protects its residents. They deserve a legacy of change that ensures their deaths meant something, that ensures no one else dies in silence, without warning, in buildings that should be sanctuaries but became death traps.